The last time I felt like myself, I was standing in a warehouse I could afford, holding a ring of keys that made noise when I walked. I'd built that place from nothing, not with speeches, just long days and stubborn luck. I moved product fast. I talked to vendors like I belonged. I shook hands, signed papers, told Claire it was finally becoming real. And for a while, it was. Then the calls changed. It wasn't one big crash. It was a slow squeeze. The bank stopped sounding friendly. Invoices stacked up and stopped getting paid. Customers needed more time. Vendors stopped answering. A couple checks bounced, then more. The warehouse got quieter each week until quiet was the only thing left. I remember walking the aisles after closing, lights off except the exit sign, staring at bare shelves like they could explain what I'd missed. Dust settled where boxes used to sit. My numbers stopped working, and I couldn't explain it to anyone, including myself. I kept my wedding band on through all of it. Simple gold, the kind you buy when you're young and sure you'll earn the better one later. After the business collapsed, it just felt like weight. Not because I didn't love Claire, but because love doesn't stop the math. Now I take whatever shifts I can get, warehouse work, cleanup, loading freight, anything that trades hours for dollars. It's honest. It's also humiliating in small ways I never knew existed, like pretending you're not tired when someone half your age tells you to hustle, like swallowing pride because pride doesn't buy groceries or pay for gas. That night, I got off late. The parking lot was half slush, half ice. My heater wheezed. My breath fogged the windshield. I sat there with my hands on the wheel, trying to decide what came next, when my phone buzzed. Claire. I didn't open it right away. Her name used to feel like home. Now it felt like standing at the edge of a drop, looking down, knowing you're going to fall either way. I opened the message, read it, read it again. Then again, slower, like the words might soften if I stared long enough. Tomorrow was Lucas's birthday. Lucas wanted me there. I reread it until the screen dimmed and my thumb woke it back up, not because it gave me hope, but because I was scared of failing him one more time. I called her before I could overthink it. "I got your text," I said quietly. "Tomorrow's his birthday. He asked for you," Claire told me, her voice flat. "I'll figure something out," I muttered, trying to stay calm. We didn't talk long. She didn't yell. That almost made it worse. She sounded tired, like she'd already spent her anger and wasn't buying more. When the call ended, I sat there listening to my engine tick as it cooled, and I realized I was shaking. I checked my wallet even though I already knew. A handful of crumpled bills, some coins, not even $20. The kind of amount you don't say out loud because it makes you feel like you don't have the right to call yourself a dad. I went back inside and asked about an advance. I tried to keep it casual, like it was a normal thing responsible people did. My supervisor shut it down fast, no hesitation, like he'd been waiting for me to ask. I tried calling a couple people I used to know. One didn't answer. Another answered and turned me down in a few short words. I didn't blame them. Still, it stung. It made me feel small in a way I hadn't felt since I was a kid. I sat in my car and stared at the dashboard until the numbers blurred. Lucas didn't need anything expensive. He needed proof. Something he could open and grin at, something that said I remembered, something that said I tried, a little box with his name on it, paper he could tear, a sound that meant I mattered for one day, even if the rest of my life was a mess. That became the whole mission, not fixing my marriage, not rebuilding my life overnight, just getting to morning with a gift in my hand, one clean win in a long line of losses. Snow started falling again. Wet and heavy, clinging to the windshield and turning into gray streaks when the wipers dragged it away. I started the car. My hands felt steady, not because I was calm, but because I'd gone numb. Numb is useful when you need to move. I pulled out of the lot and onto the road, following the signs without thinking too hard, letting habit do the steering. Streetlights thinned, then disappeared. The world turned into black pavement and flashing reflectors. Fog sat low and thick, swallowing the edges of everything. Somewhere to my right, I knew the lake was out there, a dark weight in the night, throwing its weather across the highway like a warning. I merged onto I-90 and felt that familiar hollow stretch open up in front of me, miles of wet asphalt ahead, slick and shining under my headlights. I didn't have a plan past the next exit. I just had the thought I kept repeating like it could keep me upright. One night. Just one night. I-90 at night feels like a different country. The lanes are the same, the signs are the same, but everything is muted, washed out, and cold. The fog clung to my windshield in a greasy film that the wipers couldn't quite clear. It wasn't rain, not really. It was moisture hanging in the air like breath you couldn't escape, the kind that makes headlights look tired, the kind that turns the world into a short tunnel you can't see out of. Lake effect snow cut sideways across the road in thin sheets. Not the pretty snowfall you see on postcards. This was sharp, wet, mean. It didn't pile up, it just slapped the glass and turned into slush the second it hit asphalt. My headlights stretched into smeared streaks and reflected off the wet pavement, making it feel like I was driving through a hallway lined with mirrors that kept shifting. Every few miles, another set of taillights would appear ahead, ghosting in and out as the fog thickened, then thinning until the car disappeared like it had never been there. Most of the time, it was just me and the road and the steady hiss of tires on wet blacktop. My phone sat in the cup holder. The signal bars jumped like they couldn't decide if they wanted to exist. 2 bars, 1, none. A single bar that looked more like an insult than a connection. The GPS voice tried to keep up, then lagged behind. At one point it recalculated for no reason, telling me to take an exit I'd never heard of and loop back around, like it was confused about where I was. I didn't panic. I didn't have the energy for panic, but I felt something else settle in, low and quiet. A sense that the road had thinned out around me, like I'd drifted into a stretch that didn't get used much, a pocket of highway nobody talked about. The kind of place where you could break down and no one would see your hazards blinking until morning, if they saw them at all. The fog got thicker near the lake. You could feel it, the way the air changed. The cold didn't just drop, it pressed. It pushed damp through the seams of my coat and into my bones. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, and I realized I'd been holding my breath without meaning to. A green sign flashed by. I only caught part of it. Some town name I didn't care about. Then another sign. Then the white mile marker posts on the right shoulder, appearing out of the haze like little teeth. Mile marker 77 slid past. I didn't do anything with it. I didn't slow down or stare or make a note. I just registered the number because it was simple, because it stuck. 77, 2 sevens, a neat, clean pair, something my brain could hold on to while everything else felt smeared and uncertain. A few minutes later, I saw a glow ahead on the right side of the highway. At first, I thought it was another car pulled over, hazards blinking in the fog, but the light didn't pulse. It held steady. Then it grew into a shape. A low building, barely set back from the shoulder, with a small lot and a sign out front that should have been comforting but wasn't. The light wasn't warm. It wasn't the soft yellow you get from a diner or a family-owned place that wants you to come in and thaw out. It was white and flat and wrong, like someone had turned on a surgical lamp in the middle of nowhere. It made the snow look dirty and the air look thin. The lot was stained with slush and old tire tracks. Snow pushed into gray ridges along the edges. The windows were fogged from the inside, condensation beating and streaking down the glass. The door had one of those little chimes hanging above it, the kind that's supposed to jingle bright and cheerful when someone walks in. But even from the car, I could see it hanging slightly crooked, like it was tired of doing its job. And there it was, taped to the front window in bold block letters. Night shift paid at end of shift. And I didn't pull in because my gas light was on. I didn't pull in because I needed coffee. I pulled in because those words hit a nerve in my brain. Paid, end of shift, cash implied, even if it wasn't written, enough to buy a gift in the morning without begging or borrowing or lying. I turned off the highway and rolled into the lot. The tires crunched over salt and packed slush. My headlights swept across 2 pumps and a trash can buried in snow. The place looked small, isolated, like it had no reason to be open at all, except that the lights were on and someone had bothered to put a sign in the window. I parked crooked, killed the engine, and sat for a second. The heater clicked as it died down. The silence outside felt thick. Not quiet like peace, quiet like the world was holding still. My phone buzzed again, then stopped. No new message. Just a reminder that it was barely hanging onto service. I shoved it in my pocket and got out. The cold hit hard. The kind of cold that makes your lungs feel sharp when you inhale. I walked up to the door. Up close, the glass looked smeared with fingerprints and melted snow. The chime above it shifted slightly when the wind nudged the door frame. It made a weak little sound, like it didn't have the energy to ring. Inside, the lights were bright enough to make the shelves look bleached. A narrow store, a counter, a coffee station, no customers. Just one woman behind the register, watching me like she'd been waiting. I nodded at the sign in the window. "Night shift," I said, nodding at the sign. "You looking or just reading?" Marta asked, not bothering to smile. Marta didn't move from behind the register. She didn't lean forward, didn't do the fake customer service smile. She just watched me the way a cashier watches someone they're not sure is going to bolt. Her eyes went straight to my boots first, the salt crust around the soles, the wet slush packed into the treads. Then my jeans, stiff at the knees from old dried grit. Then my hands, red from cold, knuckles cracked, the kind of hands that have been working jobs that don't ask questions. I stood there and tried not to look desperate. That was the thing. I was desperate, but I didn't want it to show. I wanted to look like a guy who was choosing this, not a guy who had run out of options and was grabbing the first rope he saw. Marta made a small sound in her throat, not quite approval, not quite disgust. More like she'd done this enough times to recognize the shape of a man who was about to say yes no matter what the offer was. She asked a couple basic things, not a full interview. Just enough to confirm I was real. Did I have a car? Did I have a license? Could I count? Could I stay awake? I nodded through most of it. I told her I could handle a register. That wasn't exactly true, but it wasn't exactly a lie either. A register's just numbers. I was good at numbers until the world decided my numbers didn't matter. She reached under the counter and pulled out a cash box, the kind with a cheap little key. She flipped it open like she was showing me a sandwich she'd packed for lunch. Neat stacks of bills inside, 20s and 10s, a few 5s. Real money, not some promise that required 2 weeks of waiting and a payroll department. 300. Cash. End of shift, Marta insisted, like she'd said it 1,000 times. My stomach tightened. 300 was more than I'd made in a day and months. It was more than enough to buy Lucas something decent. It was more than enough to not show up empty-handed. For a second, I could see it plain, like the fog on the windshield had cleared, me walking into a store at opening time, picking out a gift without checking the price tag first, me driving to Claire's mom's house with a bag on the passenger seat and a reason to hold my head up. And that was exactly why it felt wrong. I looked at her hands. They were steady. No tremor, no nerves. She wasn't selling me something. She wasn't hyping it. She said it the way you say the weather, like it was just the rate and that was that. I waited for the catch, the fine print, the part where she'd say I needed to sign something, give my social, fill out a stack of forms. The part where she'd say she paid weekly, not nightly. The part where she'd say it was up to 300, based on performance. She didn't say any of that. No paperwork, she added, like she was reading my mind. You show up, you work, you leave with cash. My instincts screamed at me not to take it. Nobody pays that kind of money for a gas station overnight shift unless there's a reason, and reasons always have teeth. But then I thought of Lucas. I thought of the way Claire's voice had sounded on the phone, flat and tired. I thought of that message sitting on my screen like a deadline I couldn't negotiate with. I didn't need to understand Marta. I needed the money. She slid something across the counter. A strip of receipt paper, longer than a normal receipt, neatly torn at the top like it had been printed on purpose. 6 lines on it, spaced out, each one short, and beside it a red pushpin, the plastic top dulled from being handled too many times. You got rules for a gas station job, I said, my voice coming out rough. Marta's eyes didn't change. Her mouth tightened like she was deciding whether I was going to be a problem. Not rules, she snapped. Instructions. The word landed different. Rules feel negotiable, like something a manager made up to keep people in line. Instructions felt like what you get when someone is trying to keep you alive. I picked up the receipt paper. It was thin and cheap, already curling at the edges from the store's heat. The print was crisp, black, plain, no logo, no heading, no explanation, just commands. I read them once, slow, 6 lines, no reasons, just what to do. If the door opens and the chime doesn't ring, I say, door's sticking, and I crouch down like I'm fixing it for 10 seconds. I don't look up right away. If the receipt printer feeds me a blank strip, I pin it to the board and I don't try to read it. After 12:30, if someone asks for a lighter, I hand them an ice cup and I say, that's all I got. If the price sign outside flickers wrong, I kill the middle aisle lights for exactly 60 seconds. I don't look out the glass while it's dark. If a customer walks in with shoes bone dry on a night like this, I open the cash drawer for exactly 3 seconds after the sale, then close it. And at 5:40, I pour a fresh cup of coffee and set it on the left edge of the counter. I leave it there until 6. It was specific in a way that made my skin prickle. Not be careful, not lock up. Something else, a sentence that told you exactly what to say, exactly what to do, down to the seconds. The second line was worse, not because it was violent, but because it was weird. It assumed something would happen that shouldn't happen in a normal place, like the paper knew the future and didn't bother pretending otherwise. By the third line, I was holding it tighter without realizing. I wasn't reading a list of suggestions. I was reading a set of moves in a game I didn't know how to play. It wasn't ghost story absurd. It wasn't don't talk to the dead. It wasn't don't look at the mirror at midnight. It was ritual absurd, the kind of thing you'd laugh at if your rent was paid and your kid's birthday wasn't tomorrow. The kind of thing you'd call superstition. The kind of thing you'd ignore right up until ignoring it cost you something you couldn't afford to lose. Marta watched my face while I read. She didn't hover. She didn't explain. She just waited like she already knew what the questions would be and had decided she wasn't answering them. When I finished, I set the paper back down on the counter like it might bite me. Marta came out from behind the register without a limp, without a hurry. She moved like a person who had a routine and didn't want it interrupted. She pointed with 2 fingers, quick and precise. Behind the counter, on the wall to the left, was a corkboard with old holes peppering it, a place where papers had been pinned and removed over and over, the kind of board nobody looks at unless they have a reason. She tapped it once, then held up the pushpin like it was part of the job. Then she pointed to the light switch near the middle aisle. Not the main store lights, just the strip that controlled that one section of shelves. She flipped it off and on once, demonstrating. The bulbs hummed when they came back, and I noticed the sound, sharp and thin. She opened the cash drawer and let it slide shut again. The drawer made a clean, mechanical sound, and it felt too loud in the quiet store, like everything in there carried farther than it should. She nodded toward a stack of clear plastic cups by the fountain machine. Ice cups, cheap, flimsy, nothing special. She made a point of it anyway. Then the receipt printer. She pressed the feed button once and a blank strip rolled out. No words, just paper. She tore it clean and set it aside like she was proving the machine worked. Finally, she gestured at the coffee station, the pot, the burner, the cheap little clock mounted above the counter that ticked loud enough to hear from anywhere in the store. The second hand moved in a steady sweep, too steady, like it had never missed a beat. She didn't explain why any of this mattered. She didn't tell me what I was supposed to be afraid of. She just showed me the objects like a surgeon laying out tools. My mouth was dry. I swallowed and tasted stale coffee in the air, old sugar, damp wool from my coat. I thought about turning around and walking out. I pictured myself back on the highway, fog and snow. No plan, no gift. I pictured Claire's face when I showed up empty-handed, if she even let me in the door. I picked up the receipt paper again. Only one night, I told myself. I could do anything for one night. I'd done worse. I'd slept in my car. I'd worked 14-hour shifts. I'd watched my life fall apart in slow motion. This was just a gas station, just a shift, just money. But when I closed my fingers around that strip of paper, my hands felt colder than they should have, like the ink had been left outside in the snow. Like the instructions weren't just written down, they were waiting. By the time the wall clock hit 9, Marta was already putting on her coat like she'd been ready to leave since the moment I walked in. She didn't give me a pep talk. She didn't wish me luck. She just checked the register, checked the coffee burner, and looked at me like she was deciding whether I was going to make it to morning or not. Before she stepped out, she gave me one last warning about not getting curious, like curiosity was something you could catch from the air in here. Then she was gone, the door closing behind her with that weak little chime that sounded more tired than welcoming. I stood there for a second after she left, listening to the store settle. The lights had a thin, steady hum. The coolers rattled in the back. The receipt printer sat quiet. Outside, the lot was empty except for my car and 2 pumps sitting under that flat white light. Snow drifted sideways across the asphalt, sticking in streaks where tires had already turned it into slush. I moved because standing still felt like a mistake. I wiped the counter even though it was already clean. I lined up the little stacks of cups by the fountain machine. I flipped through a binder under the register with inventory sheets that looked like they hadn't been updated in days. I ran the same motions over and over, the way you do when your brain is trying to pretend nothing's wrong. A few customers came in early, nothing strange. A guy in a puffy jacket grabbed a soda and a bag of chips, tapped his card, left without making eye contact. A woman in scrubs bought cough drops and a coffee, hands shaking like she'd been up too long. I printed receipts, made change, said the bare minimum. The kind of normal transactions that make you think maybe you overreacted, maybe Marta was just weird, maybe that strip of receipt paper in my pocket was a joke. I kept touching it anyway, not pulling it out, not rereading it, just checking it was still there like it mattered that I had it close. Every time my fingers hit the thin curl of paper, I felt that same small chill, like ink that had been chilled in the snow. The store smelled like cheap coffee and wet rubber, the kind of smell that clings to your clothes even after you leave. I watched the door between customers. I watched the little chime above it, hanging crooked. I told myself it was just a place, just a job, just one night. Then headlights swept across the lot and slowed, cutting through the fog and snow. A pickup rolled in, older, the kind with rust along the wheel wells. It parked close to the door like the driver had done it 100 times. The engine shut off. The door opened. Boots crunched on salted slush. Ray Dobbins walked in like he owned the place, not in a rude way, just comfortable. Middle-aged, thick jacket, knit cap pulled low, cheeks red from cold. He glanced at me, gave a small nod, then went straight to the coffee station without asking if it was okay. Local. Regular. The kind of guy who knows which lid fits the cups and doesn't bother reading the labels. He poured coffee, added sugar, stirred with one of those wooden sticks until it sounded like tapping against a drum. Then he grabbed a couple of snacks off the shelf, like he'd already decided what he wanted before he walked through the door. Beef jerky and a candy bar. Nothing special. He came up to the counter and set everything down. His eyes moved, taking in the place, then landing on the corkboard behind me. The one Marta had pointed out. The pushpin she'd handed me. The board looked normal, just old and pocked with holes, but his focus lingered on it like it meant something to him. He didn't stare long. He didn't make a big deal out of it. He just tilted his head slightly, like he was noticing a small change in a room he'd been in 1,000 times. Then he looked back at me. "Road's gonna ice up," Ray said quietly. "Yeah, I'll be here," I told him, trying to sound normal. He gave a short laugh, not mean, just tired, like he'd heard people say that and then watched them disappear down the highway anyway. He paid cash, exact bills, and didn't wait around for a receipt. He took his coffee, lifted the bag of snacks, and started toward the door. At the threshold, he paused just long enough to glance at the chime above the frame. It was subtle. If I hadn't been already watching everything too closely, I might have missed it. He didn't touch it. He didn't test it. He just looked at it the way you look at a loose step on a porch, something you don't want to trust with your full weight. Then he stepped out into the snow and was gone into the fog, his taillights fading fast like they were being swallowed. I stood behind the counter again, alone, and for the first time since Marta left, I felt the difference between silence and empty. The store wasn't just quiet, it was waiting. The parking lot stayed blank. The wind pushed snow in thin sheets across the pumps. The clock kept ticking. I kept wiping the counter and resetting displays like I could scrub the feeling off. And the whole time, without meaning to, my mind kept circling back to one small, ugly detail Ray hadn't said out loud, but had made me think about anyway. The door, the chime, the idea that sometimes things open in the night and nobody hears it happen. The stretch between 9 and 11 was the kind of boring that almost makes you relax. A couple more cars drifted in and out, people buying energy drinks, cigarettes, candy, the usual late-night stuff. Nobody looked at me too long. Nobody asked my name. The fog stayed thick outside, turning the lot into a gray smear beyond the glass. Snow kept slapping sideways across the pumps, never settling, just passing through like it didn't want to be here either. I tried to stay busy. If I stopped moving, my brain started doing what it does, dragging me back to Claire's text, to Lucas's face, to the number in my wallet that was still sitting under 20. Work was better than thinking. So I wiped the counter again. I restocked the chips. I faced the candy bars so they lined up neat, like someone would judge me if they weren't. I made a fresh pot of coffee and didn't pour myself any because coffee on an empty stomach makes my hands shake. I was in the middle aisle, lining up boxes of granola bars, when I heard the door. Not the chime. The chime didn't ring. What I heard was the faint soft hiss of the automatic track, the rubber seal peeling away from the frame, a sound like something exhaling. I froze with a box in my hands. Cold air slid into the store, and it wasn't normal cold. It didn't just drop the temperature, it carried a smell with it, wet metal and lake water, like the underside of a dock. It made my nose sting. It made my skin tighten across my arms. My reflex was immediate. Look up, see who came in, do the job. Then the receipt paper instructions flashed in my head so hard, it felt like someone yelled them. The first line, the one that told me exactly what to say. My throat went dry. My heart kicked once, hard, like it had missed a beat and was trying to catch up. I forced my feet to move even though my body didn't want to. I set the box down on the shelf too carefully, like I was trying not to make noise. I walked toward the front, toward the counter, toward the door that was standing open to a white-gray blur of fog and snow. I wanted to look up. I wanted to see who was there. I could feel my eyes trying to climb. I stopped myself. I didn't know how exactly. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was that stupid strip of paper in my pocket that had already started to feel like the only thing I owned that mattered. I stepped behind the counter and bent down, like I was reaching for something under the register, like I was checking a cord, like I had a reason to be looking at the floor instead of the doorway. "Door's sticking," I said, forcing it to sound casual. The words came out flat, not confident, not smooth, but they came out. I said them the way you'd say, "Printer's acting up," or "Register's slow," like it was just another night shift annoyance. I stayed down. 10 seconds. That was what the instruction had said. 10 seconds. Pretend to fix something. Don't look at whoever came in right away. I counted in my head. 1, 2, 3. From that low angle, I could see the threshold through the bottom half of the glass. I could see the strip of slush right outside the door, lit up by the sign and the store lights. Gray snow packed into ridges, wet shine where tires had pushed it thin. There were no fresh footprints, not a single new mark, no boot tread, no shoe print, nothing. Just the same uneven slush that had been there before the door opened, wind-swept and dirty. But there was something else. A shadow shape sat right at the doorway, blocking part of the light. Not a person, not in a way I could label, just a vertical smear of darker gray against the fog. Like someone was standing there, but the light refused to outline them. Like the world didn't want to decide what shape they were. The wind outside pushed the fog and snow sideways in waves. The shadow didn't move with it, didn't flicker, didn't shift like a normal shadow would when the light changes or the air changes. It just held. My skin crawled. The hairs on my arms lifted. My stomach dropped so fast it felt like I'd missed a step on stairs. I kept counting. 4, 5, 6. I wanted to breathe. I realized I wasn't. I was holding it like if I stayed quiet enough, it wouldn't notice me. 7, 8, 9. The cold air from the open door stayed in the store, heavier than it should be, like it was settling on the floor. It wrapped around my ankles. It smelled like wet pennies and something old. 10. I stood up. The door was closed. The automatic seal was flush again. The chime above the frame hung still and silent. The entryway was empty. The fog outside looked the same as it had a minute ago. Gray, blank, snow sweeping sideways. I stared at the spot where the shadow had been and saw nothing. I looked down at the slush outside through the glass. Still no footprints, still no disturbance, like nothing had ever stepped there. My chest hurt. I took a breath and it came in ragged. Too loud in the quiet store. I walked around the counter and checked the door sensor like that would prove anything. I waved my hand near it. The door didn't budge. I stepped back and it didn't budge. I stepped forward again and it slid open with a soft hiss, and this time, the chime made a weak little jingle like it remembered what it was supposed to do. I let it shut and stood there with my hands at my sides, trying to make sense of it. Sensor glitch, I told myself. Wind, moisture, electronics. This place is old. This place is cheap. Nothing here works right. But the cold didn't leave. That was the problem. Even with the door shut, the air near the front stayed colder than the rest of the store, like a patch of winter had been set down inside and refused to melt. I went back behind the counter and wiped the same clean spot 3 times in a row without realizing it. My hands were steady, but only because I was moving on instinct. My brain kept replaying the same detail over and over. No footprints. And I couldn't make my body forget the feeling that something had stood there, right at the threshold, inches from me, while I pretended I couldn't see it. After the door thing, I tried to force the night back into normal. I told myself it was a sensor glitch and my nerves were doing the rest. That's what adults do. We make explanations so we can keep functioning. I brewed more coffee. I faced shelves. I ran the mop over the same strip of tile near the entrance because moving in straight lines made my head feel less chaotic. Outside, the fog thickened and thinned like it was breathing. Snow kept drifting sideways in thin sheets. The pumps sat empty, lit up in that flat light that made everything look tired. Every time I glanced at the door, I half expected it to slide open again without the chime, and every time it stayed shut, I felt a little relief that tasted like embarrassment. I kept thinking about that shadow shape, not what it was, just the way it didn't move with the wind, like it was anchored. Around 11:30, the store went quiet again. No cars, no footsteps, just the hum of refrigeration and the wall clock ticking. The kind of quiet where you start hearing your own body, your heartbeat, the shift of your weight in your boots. I was behind the counter, wiping down the lottery display, when the receipt printer whirred. It wasn't the normal quick chirp it makes after a sale. This was the motor spooling up on its own, a longer, more deliberate sound, like it had decided something. A strip of paper fed out, longer than a receipt, smooth and bright under the lights. It looked blank. For a second, my brain tried to relax. I actually felt it. Like, okay, this is the joke part. This is why Marta had that push pin. The printer is glitchy. It spits paper. Somebody pinned notes up there for fun. I tore the sheet off and held it up under the light. Nothing. No logo, no numbers, no faint ink. Just plain white thermal paper. Then I remembered Rule 2. I didn't have to reach for the instructions in my pocket. I could feel them in my head like a bruise. If the printer spits out a blank sheet, pin it to the board. Don't read it. Don't read it. That part didn't make sense at first. How do you read blank paper? The paper in my hand felt too thin to matter, like the kind of thing you'd throw away without thinking. My eyes flicked toward the corkboard behind me. Old holes in the cork. The pushpin Marta had left sitting on the little ledge beneath the board like it belonged there. My fingers tightened around the paper. I didn't want to do it, not because pinning paper was hard, but because obeying that kind of instruction made me feel stupid, like I was playing along with someone else's paranoia. Still, my legs moved. I turned toward the board, keeping the paper held flat in front of me like if I bent it, it might reveal something. I pressed the pushpin through the top edge. The moment the metal point pierced the paper, I heard a faint squeal. Not loud, just a thin static sound like rubbing a balloon on fabric. It made my teeth clench. The paper shivered slightly, and for a split second, at just the right angle, I saw it. Letters. Not ink, not printed, indented, like someone had typed into the paper so hard they'd left grooves without leaving color. The words weren't fully readable in that glance, but the shapes were there, pressed into the surface, waiting for light to hit them right. My stomach turned. I leaned in without thinking, trying to catch the angle again, trying to make the letters show themselves so I could understand why my hands had gone cold. Then I stopped, because that was the whole point. That was how the thing worked. It wasn't going to force the words into my eyes with ink. It was going to offer them, subtle and tempting, and see if I'd step over the line. I pulled my head back like I'd almost touched a hot stove. My hands were shaking a little now, small tremors in the fingers. Yeah, no, I muttered, and pinned it up without looking. I forced myself to turn away from the board. I went back to the counter and wiped a spot that didn't need wiping. I rang up nothing. I checked the register, even though nobody had bought anything in 10 minutes. I tried to occupy my eyes with anything except that rectangle of paper hanging behind me like a warning. But the feeling wouldn't leave. The paper wanted to be read. That sounds insane, but it's the only way I can describe it. It felt like someone standing behind you in line, not touching you, not speaking, just close enough that you can feel the heat of their presence. Except the presence was cold. I kept imagining the words sitting there, indented and patient, waiting for me to look back, waiting for my eyes. I told myself it was nothing. Thermal paper can do weird things. Pressure can leave marks. That static squeal was just dry air and cheap corkboard. The printer whirred again. My whole body tensed like it was a gun cocking. Another sheet fed out, slow and steady. Another blank strip of paper. I stared at it like it had come out of an animal, like it was alive. I didn't touch it at first. I let it hang there for a beat, dangling from the slot. Then I tore it off, held it under the light, saw nothing, and felt that same crawl along my skin, like I was being tested. I walked it to the board and pinned it next to the first one. Static squeal again, another brief glimpse of indentations that vanished if I tried to catch them straight on. I kept my eyes down. I kept my face turned away. 2 blank sheets became 3. The printer didn't spit them out constantly, just often enough to keep my nerves tight. Every time it ran, I pinned another. Every time I pinned, I heard that faint squeal and saw just enough to make my curiosity itch. After the 4th one, the board started to look different, less like a place for flyers and notes, more like a case file, like somebody was collecting pages on me, assembling a story I wasn't supposed to read. I stood behind the counter, hands flat on the laminate, and listened to the store hum around me. The door stayed shut. The chime stayed quiet. Outside, the fog pressed up against the glass like a face without features. And behind me, the blank receipts hung in a neat row, waiting. The clock over the counter crawled past 12:30 like it was dragging weight. The store didn't look any different, but the air felt tighter, like it had decided the first half of the night was over, and now it was time to get to the point. Outside, the fog was still pressed up against the windows, thick enough that the lot lights didn't travel far. Snow kept sliding sideways through the glow, never falling straight, never settling clean. Everything out there looked smeared and unfinished. I kept my eyes off the pinboard. I could feel it behind me without looking. Those blank receipts lined up in a neat row. Every time I moved, I had the stupid urge to glance back and catch the indentations again. My curiosity kept rising like a bad habit. I kept pushing it down. I wiped the counter. I counted the cups. I restocked gum and mints. I did anything that kept my hands busy. The door opened with a soft hiss. This time the chime rang, weak but present, like the place was making an effort to act normal. Cold air rolled in anyway, that wet lake cold that smells like metal and old water. A man walked in, normal looking. Nothing about him screamed wrong. Mid-30s maybe, clean jacket, hair damp from the snow. He didn't rush. He didn't stomp slush everywhere. He moved like he was trying not to be a hassle. He came straight to the counter, hands in his pockets. His eyes didn't wander much. That was what I noticed first. Most people glance at the snack wall or the cooler or the cigarettes. This guy's attention stayed tight, like he already knew what he wanted and didn't want distractions. He leaned in slightly, polite posture, and asked for a lighter like it was the simplest thing in the world. "Got a lighter?" he asked, trying to sound polite. Rule 3 hit my brain before my mouth could do anything stupid. After 12:30, no lighters, no exceptions. Give an ice cup. Say the line. Don't explain. Don't improvise. My hand went to the stack of clear plastic cups by the fountain machine. It felt ridiculous, reaching for a cup of ice when a man asked for a lighter. My body hated it. Every part of me that had spent a lifetime smoothing situations over wanted to be normal. Wanted to say, "Sure, hold on." Wanted to add, "I'll check under the counter." Wanted to avoid the look someone gives you when you're unhelpful. I grabbed a cup and slid it across the counter. "That's all I got," I said, keeping my face blank. The words tasted wrong. Not because they were hard to say, but because they felt like I was choosing to be a jerk on purpose. His eyes dropped to the cup. He stared at it for too long, not confused long, waiting long, like he was giving me room to correct myself, like he was waiting for me to laugh and say, "Sorry, just messing with you." I didn't move. My heart was beating hard enough that I could feel it in my fingertips. The store hum seemed louder. The coolers in the back rattled like they were restless. The fog outside pressed against the glass in one solid sheet, no depth, no distance. The man's gaze stayed on the cup. His mouth tightened a little like he was holding back a comment. I could feel the moment where most people would push, where they'd say, "Come on, man," where they'd ask again, a little louder, a little more annoyed, where they'd make it a thing. He didn't. He lifted the cup with 2 fingers and held it up like he was weighing it. Clear plastic, cheap and flimsy, empty. It made no sense as an answer to his question. He turned it slightly, and the overhead lights reflected off it in thin white lines. For a second, I saw something in the reflection that made my stomach turn. Not a face, not a shape I could describe, just a distortion like the air had thickened around him. It was gone as fast as it came. My brain tried to file it under nerves, under fatigue, under the same part of me that had seen a shadow at the threshold and wanted to pretend it hadn't happened. He set the cup down on the counter again, slowly, like he wanted me to notice exactly where he placed it. Then he looked up at me for the first time in a way that felt direct. His eyes weren't dead. They weren't glowing. They were normal eyes. That was the part that scared me the most. If he looked like a monster, I'd know what to do. Fear would have a shape. But his expression was just calm, polite disappointment, like I'd failed a basic test of decency. I almost said it. I could feel the sentence pushing up the back of my throat. I can check the back. I can look under the counter. I swallowed it hard enough that it hurt. My jaw clenched. I kept my hands flat on the counter so they wouldn't shake. I stared at a spot on the register screen that wasn't even lit, just dark plastic. Anything to keep from trying to fix the interaction the way I always did. The man nodded once, like he'd heard everything I didn't say. Then he turned and walked out without another word. The chime rang again when the door opened. The cold slid in and then out. The door sealed shut. Fog swallowed him immediately. I didn't see him cross the lot. I didn't see taillights. Nothing. Just empty glass and a gray blur beyond it. I exhaled, and only then realized I'd been holding my breath. The ice cup sat on the counter between us like a joke that wasn't funny. I picked it up and turned it over. There was no ice in it. There couldn't be. But the bottom of the cup left a wet ring on the laminate, a perfect circle of moisture that looked too clean, too deliberate. I watched it for a second, expecting it to sit there like any other spill. It didn't. The ring shrank. Not evaporating slow, not drying the way water dries. It pulled inward, like something underneath the counter was drinking it. The circle tightened, got smaller, then disappeared completely, leaving the laminate dry and dull as if nothing had ever touched it. My skin went cold again. I set the cup down in the trash and stared at the spot where the ring had been. I told myself it was heat from the lights. I told myself it was cheap laminate. I told myself a lot of things. But the truth was simple. The hardest part of that moment wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was standing there and letting myself look rude, letting myself be the kind of clerk people complain about. Because somewhere in the back of my mind, louder than my pride, I understood that being polite was exactly what the night wanted from me. After the lighter guy left, the store went quiet in a way that didn't feel restful. Fog pressed against the windows until the lot looked like a blank page. Snow slid sideways through the canopy light, never piling up, just smearing the world into gray. I kept busy on purpose. Wiped the counter, straightened a shelf, checked the coffee pot, anything to keep my eyes off the pinboard behind me, because the blank receipts hanging there felt less like trash and more like bait. That's when the price sign out by the highway started acting wrong. It flickered once, quick. Then it flickered again and the digits jumped, scrambling too fast for my eyes to catch. It wasn't a simple outage. It looked like the sign was searching for something to display. I drifted toward the front window before I realized I'd moved. My breath fogged the glass from the inside. The numbers snapped into place. 77, then another 77, then another, stacked and repeated like a chant, not a price. It held there, bright and steady, and it hit the same part of my brain that had noticed mile marker 77 earlier and filed it away without thinking. Now the number was being shoved back at me, harder, like it wanted my attention to lock and stay locked. I leaned closer, and for a second my mind went empty. Just those sevens, pulsing faintly as if the sign was breathing. Rule 4 cut through it. If the sign flickers wrong, kill the middle aisle lights for exactly 60 seconds. Don't look out the glass while it's dark. Everything in me wanted to keep staring, to figure out what it meant, to prove I wasn't losing it. The instruction demanded I do the opposite. Turn away. Make the store darker. I forced myself to peel my gaze off the window and walk to the aisle switch Marta had pointed out. My hand hovered, then I flipped it. The middle aisle went dark and the store felt cut in half. Front lights still burned and the coolers threw that cold blue glow from the back, but the shelves in the center became a shadow corridor. Without those bulbs, the tick of the wall clock seemed louder. Even my breathing sounded wrong. I dropped my eyes to the tile. I didn't look at the glass. I didn't look at the sign. 60 seconds, I whispered to myself, my voice barely there. I counted under my breath and stared at the floor near my boots. Salt crystals, a wet streak where slush had been dragged in. I pressed my palms against the counter edge because I needed something solid. At around 5, I heard it. A scrape on the front window. Not a bang, not a slam. Slow, careful, like a fingernail dragged in a straight line. Then a pause. Then another line. Patient, deliberate. The urge to look up hit hard. Just a glance, my brain begged. I kept my eyes down and kept counting. My shoulders were tight, jaw clenched like my body was bracing for a hit that never came. The scraping shifted along the glass, still methodical. A light click followed, like a nail tapping the metal frame. Once, then silence. Then another scrape, closer to the door. It wasn't trying to break in. It was trying to get noticed. That's when I understood what the instruction really was. It wasn't about lights. It was about attention. The sign demanded my eyes. The scraping demanded my eyes. And the ritual demanded I refuse. The scraping stopped long enough that relief started to rise. Then it resumed again, as if silence was another tool. 58, 59. Right before 60, the scraping cut off clean and sudden, like it knew exactly when the timer would end. 60. My fingers trembled as I flipped the aisle lights back on. Bright white filled the shelves again, erasing the shadow corridor. I forced myself to look out the window. The sign had gone back to normal prices, steady glow, boring digits. The lot looked empty. Fog. Sideways snow. My heart was hammering. I turned toward the counter, needing something inside to make sense. That's when I saw the pin board. A new blank receipt was pinned dead center, perfectly aligned with the others, like it had always been there. The printer hadn't fed paper. I would have heard the motor. There was no warm strip hanging out, no torn edge, no reason for that page to exist. Another sheet had been added while the lights were out, and the worst part was how badly I wanted to step closer, tilt it toward the light, and read whatever was waiting in those indentations. I didn't. I kept my hands on the counter, breathed through my nose, and let the store pretend it was ordinary. After the 60-second blackout, the store looked normal again. That was the problem. I could still feel the cold patch by the front door, like the night had left a handprint on the air. I kept my eyes off the board anyway. I didn't trust myself to look at it without leaning in. I didn't trust my brain not to chase those indentations like a starving dog chasing a smell. I went back to routine. I wiped down the register area. I straightened the cup stacks. I threw out an old pot of coffee and brewed another, even though my stomach was still too tight to drink it. I checked the door sensor once, then told myself to stop checking it, because checking it was its own kind of looking. Outside, the lot stayed empty for a while. Fog and snow and the two pumps sitting under white light. I watched the highway through the glass and saw nothing but the occasional smear of headlights passing without slowing. It was the kind of night where most people stayed on the road and didn't stop unless they had to. I was starting to think maybe the weird stuff came in waves, like weather, when the door slid open again. The chime rang this time, a weak little jingle that sounded like a bell in a cold church. The air shifted. Cold rolled in and then settled, not the sharp blast from earlier, more like a quiet lowering of temperature. A man walked in. He didn't stomp slush off his boots. He didn't shake snow from his coat. He didn't have fog on his shoulders. That was the first thing I noticed, even before his face. Outside was wet and icy and ugly, the kind of conditions that leave everyone damp. But he looked untouched by it, like he'd stepped out of a dry hallway instead of a storm. His shoes were the second thing, perfectly dry, clean, no salt crust, no grit stuck in the seams, no wet shine, not even a scuff that said he'd crossed a slushy parking lot. They were ordinary shoes in every other way, dark and plain, but the dryness made them feel wrong, like the laws of the night didn't apply to him. He didn't look around the store. He didn't browse. He moved straight to a shelf near the counter, picked up a cheap item, one of those small packs of gum or mints, and walked to the register with it held between two fingers. His posture was calm, almost careful, like he didn't want to disturb anything. He set the item down. His eyes stayed on the counter. Not on me. Not on the lottery display. Not on the pinboard behind me. On the counter, and then, subtly, on the cash drawer. Like he knew exactly where it was, like he'd come for that, not for the gum. "Just this," he said quietly. His voice wasn't creepy. It wasn't distorted. It was a normal voice, soft and plain, like he didn't want to be overheard. "Sure," I told him, trying to keep my hand steady. I rang it up. The register beep sounded too loud in the quiet. I watched the screen flash the total, a small amount. My hands wanted to move faster, to get it done and get him out, because something about the way he waited made my skin crawl. He didn't fidget. He didn't shift his weight. He just stood there and watched that drawer like he was waiting for the moment it opened. He paid exact change. Not close. Exact. Bills and coins placed neatly on the counter like he'd counted it out before he walked in. Rule 5 stirred in my head, sharp and immediate. If someone comes in with shoes dry as bone when the world outside is wet, open the cash drawer for exactly 3 seconds after the transaction, then close it. It didn't say why. None of the instructions did. They just told you what to do, like obedience was the only protection you were getting. I picked up the money and put it in the drawer. My fingers felt stiff, like they didn't belong to me. I could feel his eyes on the drawer, tracking every movement. It wasn't an aggressive stare. It was expectation. Like he knew what came next and was waiting to see if I'd do it right. I swallowed, reached for the drawer, and pulled it open. 1, 2, 3. 3 seconds is nothing in real life. You blink and 3 seconds are gone. But standing there with that drawer open, hearing the store hum, feeling the man's attention like weight on my hands, 3 seconds turned thick. My brain started doing what it always does when it's nervous. It tried to anchor itself in numbers, count the bills, confirm the coins, say the amount out loud, something, anything that feels like control. I could almost hear my own voice in my head, starting the old habit. $17 in 20s, 5s, 1s, whatever. A useless little ritual of my own that made the world feel orderly. And then I heard something else. A voice, close to my right ear, not loud, not a whisper that rasped or hissed, just clear, slow counting, like someone standing beside me calmly reading numbers from a page. 1, 2, 3, 4. The sound crawled across my skin. It wasn't coming from the front of the counter. It wasn't coming from the door. It was right there, inside my personal space, like breath in my ear. My mouth went dry. My jaw loosened without me meaning to. The voice kept counting, steady and patient, like it wanted me to join in, like it was waiting for my lips to copy the rhythm. like it didn't care what numbers it said as long as I repeated them. 5, 6, 7. I realized my tongue was already moving, forming the start of a word I hadn't chosen. My throat tightened as I forced it closed. I kept my eyes on the drawer. I kept my hands on the edge, waiting for the 3 seconds to pass, even though my mind was screaming that they weren't passing fast enough. The counting voice paused just for a beat, like it was listening for me to answer. The man across the counter didn't move. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look curious. He looked like he was watching a clock I couldn't see. I closed the drawer. The moment it clicked shut, the counting voice stopped, cut off mid-number like a radio switched off. The silence that followed was heavy and immediate, making my ears ring. I didn't say anything. Not thanks. Not have a good night. Nothing. The instructions hadn't told me to speak, and after what I'd just heard, I didn't trust my mouth. The man picked up his gum. He gave the smallest nod, like I'd performed something correctly. Then he turned and walked out. The chime rang weakly as the door opened and closed. Cold air moved in and out. The fog swallowed him the second he stepped beyond the glass. I watched the lot, watched the slush by the door, watched for the prints that should appear if a person walked across wet snow. Nothing changed. No fresh footprints, no scuff marks, no disturbed slush. It stayed smooth and dirty and untouched, like the night was resetting itself behind him. I stood behind the counter with my hands hovering above the drawer, afraid to touch it again, afraid the counting would start back up if I gave it the chance. My heart was pounding hard enough to make my vision pulse. I stared at the register screen and tried to think about anything else. Lucas's birthday, the gift, the money, morning. But the sound of that counting voice stayed in my head anyway, slow and clear, like it had found a place to live there, like it didn't need to whisper in my ear anymore. It could wait until I was tired enough to say the numbers for it. After the man with the dry shoes left, I stood behind the counter and didn't move. The cash drawer sat there like a trap I'd almost sprung. My ears still felt full of that slow counting voice, even though the store had gone quiet again. I kept my hands on the laminate and waited for my pulse to stop kicking in my throat. The receipt printer started up on its own. The motor whirred, steady and sure enough, and a strip of paper fed out like it had been commanded. It looked blank. I held it under the light anyway, tilting it, searching for ink, for a logo, for a total, for anything that made sense. Nothing. Just white thermal paper, too clean to be comforting. Rule 2 pressed hard in my head. Pin it, don't read it. I tore the strip off and crossed to the corkboard. The pushpin bit through the paper with a faint static squeal that made my jaw clench. For a split second, at the right angle, indentations flashed, letters without ink, like someone had written with pressure alone. I jerked my eyes away before my brain could assemble them into words. The printer ran again, and again. It wasn't constant, it was measured like a metronome. Each time another blank strip slid out, each time I pinned it up. I lined them neatly because order was the only thing I could control. The board started looking less like a place for notes and more like a file, like someone was documenting me, page by page, while I worked a shift I hadn't earned the right to understand. I tried not to stare at the papers, but my eyes kept catching hints. A curve that might be an O, a hard angle that might be an A, a shallow line that could have been my name if I let myself believe it. The urge to lean in and read was sharp, almost physical, like hunger. The door chimed. A young woman stepped in. She didn't stomp slush off her boots. She didn't shake snow from her sleeves. She looked normal, coat, hair pulled back, face calm. For half a heartbeat, normal felt like relief right then. Then she looked straight at the pinboard. Not the quick glance a customer gives a wall. A steady look, like she already knew it was there and was checking it. She walked to the counter without browsing, stopped in the usual spot, and reached for the newest blank strip I hadn't pinned yet. She held it up and tilted it like she knew exactly how to catch the grooves. "Can you read this for me?" she asked softly. My mouth opened with the reflex I'd spent my whole life building. Help. Fix. Be polite. The request was small, harmless on paper. That's what made it dangerous. Refusing it would make me feel like a jerk. Accepting it would make me break Rule 2. "I can't," I said, my voice coming out tighter than I wanted. She studied me without blinking, calm as a person waiting for an elevator. No anger, no impatience, just certainty. "You can," she insisted, calm as anything. "You just won't." The truth of it hit hard. I could read it. I could take the paper, tilt it, chase the indentations until my brain did what brains do and turned shapes into meaning. Nothing stopped me except choice, and that meant the choice mattered. She lowered the strip slightly, still holding it like an offering, and her voice stayed gentle, almost practical. She said Lucas's name like she'd heard it 100 times. Then she mentioned his age and the kind of toy he'd been obsessed with lately, the small ones he could carry from room to room. She mentioned a phrase Claire used when she was done arguing: short texts, periods, no warmth left to negotiate with. She didn't threaten me. She didn't gloat. She just spoke like she knew my life better than I did. The air felt tighter around her, like the store had leaned in to listen. My first instinct was to challenge her, to demand how she knew, to make it make sense. The instructions didn't give me a rule for that, and the night had already taught me that questions were another kind of opening. So I did the only thing I could do. I stayed quiet, and I let the fear settle where the anger wanted to live. My hands went cold. I kept them flat on the counter. I stared at the register screen, dark and useless, because looking at the paper felt like stepping closer to the edge of something I couldn't climb back from. That's when I understood what the night wanted from me. Not blood, not a scream. A choice I made with my own hands, something voluntary, something I could justify as kindness. She let silence sit between us, heavy and patient. She let me think about morning, about a gift bag on the passenger seat, about Lucas ripping paper and grinning, about Claire watching me for 1 second without that exhausted look. She didn't need to say much. The idea did the work. All I had to do was read one line. My eyes burned. My throat tightened. I felt my body leaning toward the paper in tiny movements I had to stop one by one. The indentations might as well have been glowing for how badly my brain wanted to solve them. I didn't. I shook my head once, small and controlled. I kept my hands where they were. I refused to reach. For a moment, her expression shifted into something that almost looked like disappointment, the way someone looks at you when you won't take help you clearly need. Then, her gaze flicked to the wall clock above the coffee station. I followed it without thinking. The time looked slippery. The digits softened at the edges when I focused. I blinked and the second hand seemed to jump farther than it should, then settle back into a steady tick like nothing happened. My stomach dropped anyway. Behind me, the pinboard fluttered. Just a few of the blank receipts lifted and settled like a breath passed over them. The door was shut. The windows didn't rattle. There shouldn't have been any draft. The woman still held the paper out. I didn't look at it. I stood there in the bright hum of Lakeview Fuel, feeling the air thicken, feeling the night lean in close, waiting to see if being decent would finally make me break. She held the paper there a few seconds longer, like she was giving me one last chance to reach. Then she stepped back, and when I blinked, the space in front of the counter was empty again. Time didn't move right after she left the counter the first time. The store stayed bright, the coolers kept rattling, and the wall clock kept ticking, but my head felt like it was floating half an inch behind my eyes. I kept working, because that's what I do when I'm scared. I wiped the counter until the laminate squeaked. I refilled the napkin holder. I faced the candy bars like neat rows could force the night to act normal. When the printer pushed out a blank strip, I pinned it up without looking. Outside, the fog didn't lift. It thinned and thickened in slow waves, like something breathing against the windows. Snow slid sideways under the canopy light, never gentle, never clean. A few times, headlights smeared past on the highway without slowing, and I felt a quick stab of envy. Those drivers could stop anywhere and never think about what waited under the lights. I kept checking the clock even though I didn't want to. Rule 6 sat in my pocket like a rock. 5:40. Pour a fresh cup of coffee. Set it on the left edge of the counter. Leave it there until the shift ends. Simple, stupid, and somehow heavier than the rest. The closer the minute hand crept, the tighter my throat got. I kept thinking about Lucas, about a gift bag on the passenger seat, about Claire's face at the door, tired and guarded, and Lucas peering around her, searching for me. At 5:40 exactly, I moved like I was following a drill. I grabbed a clean cup from the stack. My hands shook a little, not from cold, from pressure. I poured coffee from the pot and watched the dark stream fill the cup, steam rising in a thin ribbon that didn't smell comforting anymore. It smelled bitter and sharp, like burnt sugar and old metal. I carried it with both hands, careful like a spill would count as failure. I set the cup down on the left edge of the counter and took my hands away. It felt like setting down something I owed, an offering, even though I hated that word. I stood back and forced myself not to adjust it, not to nudge it, not to do anything extra. The instructions hated extra. Every time I improvised tonight, the store pushed back. The door chimed, and she was there again, walking in like she'd been waiting just outside the glass. She looked normal, coat neat, hair pulled back, no snow melting on her shoulders. The normalness was the point. Normal makes you polite. Normal makes you help. She stopped across from the coffee and looked down at it like she was checking a mark, then lifted her eyes to me, calm and patient, like we were negotiating a late fee instead of my life. "Just one line," she said, almost kind. My stomach turned. One line and I could make it in time. One line and I could walk into that house like a father instead of a stranger dropping a bag on the porch. One line and Lucas wouldn't have to search for me through a window. I could feel my hands wanting to reach for the paper that wasn't even in her hand right now. The pinboard behind me might as well have been humming. I made myself think about the pattern, because thinking was the only thing between me and my worst habits. The night didn't want my blood. It wanted my consent. The door without a chime. The blank receipts that begged to be read. The counting voice that tried to climb into my mouth. The tests weren't about strength. They were about reflexes, about that urge to smooth things over and fix problems fast. The instructions weren't there to protect me from a monster. They were there to protect me from myself. I stared at the coffee. If I read the line, maybe nothing happened right away. Maybe I walked out at 6 with cash and a gift and a clean conscience. And maybe the night followed me out because I'd opened the one door it needed opened. I pictured Lucas's hands on my face, the way he used to grab my cheeks when he laughed. I pictured that counting voice riding in my throat, waiting for me to speak around my kid. "No," I said quietly, and hated how small it sounded. She didn't flinch. She didn't get angry. She watched me like she'd already seen this choice play out 100 times. For a moment, I thought she might step closer and force it. Instead, she tilted her head like she was listening to something deeper in the store. The fluorescent hum thickened for a second. The lights flickered once, a quick blink. The blank receipts on the board behind me lifted and settled like they'd felt a breath pass over them. The coffee cup didn't move. "You'll regret that," she muttered, like she was talking about the weather. She turned and walked toward the door without rushing. I kept my eyes on the counter edge, on the coffee, on the exact spot I'd placed it. The door slid open. The chime didn't ring. Cold air rolled in, wet metal lake cold, and then the door closed itself again, smooth and silent, like it had never been touched. When she was gone, the store didn't feel safer. It felt emptier in a worse way. Like the tests had stopped because the night had already gotten what it wanted from me, even without the line. I stood there and waited for 6, watching the steam fade from the coffee, swallowing the worst feeling of all. I didn't know if I'd just done the right thing. The wall clock clicked over to 6 like it had been waiting all night to prove it still worked. Outside, the sky had gone from black to a thin, watery gray. Fog still hugged the lot, but it didn't feel as heavy. The snow kept sliding sideways, softer now, like it was running out of anger. I stood behind the counter and watched the coffee cup on the left edge, the one I'd set down at 5:40. The surface was dark and still. No steam, no movement. It looked like any other cup you'd forget on a counter, except my whole body felt like it was built around not touching it. Headlights swept across the pumps, and the door opened a few seconds later. The chime rang, weak but present. Marta walked in without hesitation, boots crunching on slush, coat zipped up, hair neat, face empty of small talk. She did one slow scan of the store, the floor by the entrance, the counter, the coffee station, the middle aisle lights like she was checking off boxes in her head. Her eyes landed on the pinboard behind me. The blank receipts covered it now, row after row. She didn't flinch. She didn't pause. She looked at it the way you look at a weather report you already expected. Then she stepped behind the counter, opened the register, and counted with fast hands. She didn't say numbers out loud. She didn't comment on anything. The silence felt deliberate, like speaking was another kind of mistake. When she finished, she pulled a banded stack of bills from her pocket and set it down between us like a normal business deal. Not a reward, not a favor, just payment. The money was real. Clean 20s, 300 exactly. My chest tightened anyway. My hands hovered over it for half a second, then closed around the stack. The paper felt warmer than everything else in that store. I wanted to ask her what this place was. I wanted to ask why a door could open without a sound, why paper could appear without a machine running, why my own mouth had almost betrayed me with numbers I didn't choose. The question sat right at the back of my throat. I swallowed it. Curiosity had the same shape as every other trap I'd seen tonight. It looked harmless. It felt reasonable. It begged for one more step. I'd spent years chasing answers, chasing fixes, chasing the idea that if I understood the system, I could beat it. That instinct was what had burned my life down in the first place. It was what almost got me killed in that store. So I took the money and nodded. Nothing more. I walked out into the cold morning, and the air hit my face like a slap. Wet snow smell, exhaust, lake wind. My car sat in the lot coated in a thin crust of ice. I scraped the windshield with the edge of an old card until I could see enough to drive. My fingers went numb, then burned as they warmed again inside my pockets. The road didn't fold. The highway didn't loop back. I kept waiting for it, the way you wait for pain after you've already been hit. But the GPS behaved. The lanes stayed straight. The sky lightened in slow, honest steps. The first store I found that was open was too bright. Warm lights, clean floors, people buying coffee like the world hadn't changed overnight. I walked the aisles with the cash in my jacket and picked out a small model truck, the kind Lucas liked. Not the biggest, not the fanciest. Just the right size for a kid's hands, something he could roll across the floor and make engine noises with. I didn't choose it by price. I chose it by memory. By the way he'd sit on the living room rug and line his toys up like they mattered. By the way he'd look up at me for approval, like my attention was worth more than anything in a box. I grabbed a gift bag and tissue paper, paid fast, and left without looking at the receipt printer. That should have been nothing. It wasn't nothing. The bag sat on the passenger seat like a promise as I drove toward Claire's mom's house. The closer I got, the tighter my stomach turned. I kept thinking about the white receipt girl, saying Lucas's name like she owned it too. I kept thinking about the pinboard fluttering in a room with no draft. I kept thinking about my hands on that counter, doing exactly what I was told, and how the night still felt like it was taking notes. I parked down the street instead of in the driveway. Old habit, a way to make myself smaller. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of quiet you get early on a winter morning when people are still inside with heat and coffee. My breath came out in white puffs as I walked up the sidewalk with the gift bag in my hand. I stopped before the porch. Through a gap in the curtains, I could see Lucas on the living room floor, socks on his feet, wrapping paper scattered around him. He was laughing, head thrown back, the sound so normal it hurt. Claire was nearby, not smiling wide, but softer than she'd been in months, like she'd allowed herself one good morning. My chest tightened and my feet refused to take the last few steps. All I could think about was my hands, where they'd been, what they'd touched, the way the night had tried to get inside my mouth, inside my eyes, inside my choices. I pictured walking in and hugging Lucas, and for a second, I felt that cold patch by the gas station door again. I heard the scraping on glass. I heard slow counting in my ear. I imagined Lucas looking up at me, and something looking back through him. I couldn't risk it. I forced myself to move just enough to reach the porch. I set the gift bag down by the door, tucked close to the mat so it wouldn't tip. I didn't knock. I didn't ring the bell. I just stood there staring at the door like it was a line I wasn't allowed to cross. "Happy birthday, buddy," I whispered, my voice cracking. I backed away, got into the car, and shut the door with a soft, careful click. "I'm here," I told myself, even though I wasn't going to knock. At the first stop sign, I looked over at the passenger seat. A blank strip of receipt paper lay there, perfectly flat. A tiny pinhole marked the top edge like a needle had gone through it. I stared for 1 second, long enough to feel the old itch rise, that hunger to tilt it into the light and find the words hiding in the grooves. I didn't. I shoved it into the glove compartment under old papers and a spare rag and slammed it shut. Then I drove away, hands tight on the wheel, knowing I'd made it out alive. I just didn't believe I was safe to be seen.